This won't be a comprehensive discussion of Richard III, but I did want to touch upon a few major points in the play that we might not have had a chance to talk about in class at this point. So, one of them is considering Richard's disabilities. We know that he has a hunchback that's pretty severe, and the play also mentions his arm being deformed in some way. He describes it as a blasted, withered sapling. Now, when we read that, we could think about that in different ways. I mean, sometimes it might even encourage some sympathy or at least understanding of why he is chosen to become a villain. But in the period, the perception of disabilities like that, or any kind of um, deformed physical features, were interpreted differently. And so, kind of similarly to how we've seen and talked about um, early understandings of race based on the way that sort of whiteness is described in plays and other writing in the period as representing purity and good, and blackness is representing sort of corruption and evil. Uh, Anyone who is considered sort of ugly or grotesque in some way, some kind of um, physical features that weren't considered normal, those, at least in a literary context, could be perceived as signs of corruption and evil. Certainly in poems and prose and plays from the period, villains would often be described as being some kind of having an ugliness, some sort of facial features or appearance that made them unattractive, and that was seen as a kind of outward sign of their inward corruption and villainy. And similarly, sort of heroes were often described as being very beautiful, sort of perfect looking, based on the beauty standards of the period. And that was seen as an outward presentation of their inward goodness and purity. And so with Richard, the descriptions that we would get in the play would have conjured for people in the period the idea of monstrous births, for one thing. And so this is something that's worth being aware of and understanding the kind of historical context to really have a better idea for how an early modern audience would have interpreted Richard's character. So there are a lot of broadsides, mostly from the mid 16th century, that talk about sort of monstrous births. And so these are one page, almost news stories, news article kind of things that, would detail different current events. In this case, monstrous births are the ones I'm going to show you, but broadsides would also be news articles talking about all kinds of other stuff, royal proclamations and battles and international affairs and all kinds of things. So this is one that says up here, it's in black letter, so it's a little bit hard to read the font style of it. A description of a monstrous child born at Chichester in Suffolk. It gives the date, this being the very length and bigness of the same. Bigness is a little bit tough there. And so you see you get a drawing, a woodcut here. And then below there's actually a poem. We'll look at some other ones here. This one is the form and shape of a monstrous child born at Maidstone in Kent, October 1568. So you can see mid 16th century here, during Shakespeare's lifetime, almost late 16th century. So flee such vices far as might the soul deprave, to fashion even as he will, in good shape or in ill. And here you get a prose description of the story of this particular monstrous birth, in black letter. A lump of flesh on the back, so this is part of this is describing a hunchback. Down here, it's which may be a terror as well to all such workers of filthiness and iniquity as to those ungodly livers who, if in them any fear of God be, may move them to repentance and amendment of life. So this is a true description of a monstrous child, born on the Isle of Wight. We get the date there. Form with a cluster of long hair about the navel. The father's name is James. I can't read the whole thing there. In the parish of Fretwater, I think that is. So right in the sort of subtitle area here, it mentions the father by name. And this is another one where we get verse. And here is the true form and shape of a monstrous child, which was born in Stony Stratford in Northamptonshire. So Stratford is sort of the county. Well, Northamptonshire is the county. Stratford is the area within the county where Stratford upon Avon is located. So this would have been geographically very close to Shakespeare. And you see where it says this is the fore part, this is the back part. So this appears to be kind of Siamese twins, two twins fused together. Which here we go. Which child was born out of wedlock? The father's name is Richard Southern, who is now fled, and the mother is yet living in the same town. And this child was brought up to London, where it was seen of diverse worshipful men and women of the city and also of the country, to witness that it is a truth and no fable, but a warning of God to move all people to amendment of life. This is the true report of the form and shape of a monstrous child born in, I can't read what that is, a village 3 miles from Colchester in the county of Essex, and this is 1562. O pray the God and bless his name, his mighty hand hath wrought the same. So in the play, we get a few descriptions of Richard that would have evoked this idea of monstrous births. And I think there's at least one in the previous play, Henry VI, Part 3, as well. But this one from early on, when Margaret is first appears on stage and is giving all of her curses, notice that she mentions, "Thou that was sealed in thy nativity, the slave of nature and the son of hell, thou slander of thy heavy mother's womb, thou loathed issue of thy father's loins." So, talking about being born a monster, an abortive rooting hog. Um, she uses lots of descriptions of Richard as an animal, a toad, a hog, a boar. And then we also get some descriptions of Richard being born with teeth. In this case, it is young York talking to the Duchess, mentioning that he had been told that his uncle had been born with teeth that he could actually bite and chew bread when he was 2 hours old. And that idea of being born with teeth was a specific description of some monstrous births. Not to mention Richard's deformities, of course, too, with his hunchback and his withered arm. And here you see Margaret again, had his teeth before his eyes. So, also thinking of Richard's villainy, we've talked a bit about the stage Machiavel and how that character type works, some of the conventions of stage Machiavels. Another important character type is the medieval vice. So, in English drama before Shakespeare, there are a few different genres to be aware of, and a couple of the most important ones are miracle plays and morality plays. And so some of these have survived, and people still read them sometimes, particularly in British literature surveys and that kind of thing. So morality plays in particular have allegorical personifications. You would have a character named Good Deeds or Sloth or Charity, and that character would be a personified representation of the abstract concept of sloth or good deeds or charity. So the whole thing was allegorical. Everyman is probably the best known one of these for modern readers. And so these often had characters of virtues and vices that would be interacting with a main character, the protagonist, and sort of allegorically playing out different things in that way. So in Richard III, he actually specifically compares himself to Iniquity, one of the vice figures. So the vice is a specific character type from morality plays. Iniquity is one name that was used for the vice in at least a couple of those plays that have survived. Other ones include Ambidexter, I remember from a play. And so the vice might have different names, different specific characteristics in a play, but generally the vice talks directly to the audience, makes jokes, is sort of in charge of trying to corrupt the main character to lead them astray. And Richard identifies himself as Iniquity. He's basically trying to win over the audience in some ways, right? He's trying to communicate with the audience directly. He gets these soliloquies. He makes jokes. He tries to be very sort of appealing and enjoyable in some ways. And the idea there may be, at least in part, that the audience themselves could be at risk of being kind of corrupted if they enjoyed him too much, if they got into his villainies a little bit more than they really should. And then also we've got in the play, Margaret is one of the main characters that we haven't had too much of a chance to discuss. And I mentioned here her being a sort of ghostly presence. In that early scene, when she first shows up to start cursing everyone, there are many lines before she kind of reveals herself to the rest of the characters on stage, in which she is basically, listening to their conversation and giving all of these asides. So she sort of walks onto the stage and is there present on stage, but nobody else on stage sees her. And then as they're talking, she gives all these little comments and snide remarks about, sort of based on what they're saying. And then she decides to finally reveal herself and starts interacting with them directly and cursing them and all of that good stuff. So Margaret was the last Lancastrian queen, um, the wife of Henry VI, and when her husband was killed and Richard's older brother Edward ascended the throne, she was exiled to France, where she lived for years, several years, until she died there. And so she's a complete anachronism. She shouldn't be in this play, basically. And she has this kind of ghostly presence. It's also interesting that her curses seem prophetic. You know, they're not just foreshadowing. I mean, they actually happen. You know, they almost seem like they have a magical power that later on, when Queen Elizabeth in particular is asking Margaret to teach her how to curse, she wants to know how to curse in a way that will be as effective as Margaret's curses have been, because they seem to have come true, at least from the perspective of the characters in the play. Richard's character in the previous play, he's not as explicitly a main character and a villain. He gets a very long soliloquy toward the end of Henry VI Part 3. That should actually be Part 3. He gets a long soliloquy in which he is very clearly villainous and talking about being a Machiavel and trying to get the crown at no matter the cost. But overall, other than that, he's just, you know, a sort of aristocratic warrior, one of the sons of York. And we get some description of his disabilities, but we don't have a lot of sense of him as being a major character in that play. Margaret is a major character in the Henry VI plays, and she is very different from how she appears in this play. So she's got this kind of ghostly presence here. In the Henry VI plays, she is a kind of warrior queen. She leads Henry's armies because Henry VI is depicted in Shakespeare's plays as a very ineffective, very sort of overly pious king. He's much more concerned with, you know, his devotion and almost wanting to be like a monk than he is with actually leading and during the War of the Roses, a kind of civil war, actually fighting battles and things. So his wife Margaret has to take that up for him. And at times she's very villainous. She can seem very similar to Tamora and Titus Andronicus. There's a conversation between her and the Duke of York, Richard and Edward and Clarence's father, the Duchess of York's husband, who dies before the play Richard III happens. There's a conversation between him and Margaret, who are direct enemies. She's the queen, a Lancastrian queen. He is the Duke of York, who's trying to take the crown from her husband. And so at one point he's captured, and the Lancastrian forces have murdered one of his other sons, Rutland, who gets mentioned a couple of times in Richard III, but he's already dead before the play starts. And so Margaret has a handkerchief that's been soaked in Rutland's blood, and she puts a paper crown on York and mocks him as this paper king, and then takes this bloody handkerchief soaked in the blood of his child and throws it in his face and says a lot of really nasty stuff to him. And so she's this very like villainous but also active sort of warrior queen in the previous plays, and then in this play becomes this very different kind of ghostly presence, and almost seems to have supernatural powers and the way that her curses work, or at least she can be read that way. So to make a Shakespeare play easier to read, you can replace, as you're reading it in your head, thou and thee with you, and thy and thine with your or yours. And that will allow you to kind of modernize it as you are reading it, if you slow down and pay attention enough and do that. But Shakespeare plays frequently include you and your as well. It's not always just thou and thy and thine. And sometimes there's a really good reason for using one instead of the other. So in some other languages like French and Spanish, there's a formal and informal second person pronoun. Many people are familiar with at least one of these. And so in the French, you get the formal vous or the informal tu. In Spanish, you get usted and tu. And the informal version is used with friends, family, children. The formal version is supposed to be used with strangers, bosses, anyone in a sort of formal context that you want to show respect to. And so historically, there have been class implications that aren't really in play anymore. Someone of high status, an aristocrat, nobility, could use the familiar form with anyone below them. So they would use it with their own servants, but also anyone they encountered on the street that they knew was below them in hierarchy, probably based on their clothing, they could use the familiar form with. And on the other hand of that, the familiar form, if it's used for somebody's betters, their superiors, somebody who's above them, would be a show of disrespect and could be a serious insult. And we'll see this play out in a few plays in certain ways where Shakespeare uses this distinction. Because in English, there is a formal and informal version also. We just don't still use both. So the thous and the thys and the thines that sound so old-fashioned to us and remind us of like the King James Bible and other documents and writings from the period sound very old-fashioned. Those are actually the informal second-person pronoun. So at some point, English speakers just stopped using it entirely. We only use the formal version now. And even during Shakespeare's lifetime, thou was going out of style. People probably didn't say that very much, if at all, in their regular day-to-day dealings. But they remembered and were aware of the social implications of the formal and informal. And so Shakespeare uses that sometimes. Not all the time. He's not always consistent about it. But sometimes he does, and that gives you some material that is open for interpretation then, where you can think about how does the switch maybe work here? Is there any kind of consistency to it? So here we're looking again at Act 1, Scene 3 with Margaret and her curses. So before Margaret actually reveals herself, she is thouing everyone. All of the little comments and snide remarks she makes in her asides, she pretends like she's talking to the person, but it's only so the audience can hear. But she is using thou consistently throughout it. Everybody is below her in her mind. And she can refer to them that way because, as far as she's concerned, she's the only legitimate queen. The current queen, Elizabeth, Edward's queen, has stolen her position just as Edward stole her husband's crown. When she is talking even to Queen Elizabeth, painted queen, vain flourish of my fortune. So she's being very insulting here. But part of the insult is thou sugar ensnareth thee about. The day will come, thou shalt wish. And the shout there sounds very sort of prophetic. almost sounds like the Ten Commandments, the thou shouts. But the thou in particular here has class implications. It's an insult to the queen. And she starts shaming him and everyone else, but she switches to you. And Rivers uses you here, which is appropriate because Rivers is lowborn. He's a member of the queen's family who have only become sort of raised up socially because Edward married her, Queen Elizabeth. So here, Queen Margaret saying that everybody should serve her, they should be her subjects. It's interesting because she's kind of commanding, but at the same time she's saying, teach me to be your queen, that you should do me duty. She's not saying do it, she's saying you should. And it's all yous here. And so she's being a little bit kind of respectful and deferential in a way that she hadn't been just a moment earlier. And here it's interesting, she switches back to the informal with Buckingham, who, she says, "Oh, princely Buckingham." Buckingham is a really high-ranking aristocrat. She's saying, "Oh, princely Buckingham," but then she's talking with the thous and these. She's saying, "I'll kiss thy hand." It's almost like she's being familiar with him in a way that's trying to endear him to her. We'll more often see this kind of thing when one character is trying to woo another, and they might be very formal for a time in front of other people or something like that, but then they'll switch to the informal as soon as they have a chance to talk together because the character who's trying to woo the other wants to already be referring to them as though they have an intimate relationship. So in some sense, that might be what's going on here. Not quite that Queen Margaret's trying to woo Buckingham, but that she wants to endear herself to him in a particular way that she thinks that using the informal might help that. And so here you see she's still vowing Buckingham, even though now she's upset with him for blowing her off. And then she switches to you and yours when she's addressing the entire party, right? So she goes back to formality with everybody else in the same speech, a very short speech in which she started with thou and thee, referring to Buckingham.